little bit of background on the State of the State addresses themselves. To everything, there is a season, and we've just about wrapped up the annual season of State of the State addresses with Governor DeWine of Ohio just giving one of the last addresses just a few hours ago. All 50 state constitutions mandate that a governor give an annual or a regular report to their state legislature, and it usually comes in the form of an address that reflects on the condition of the state and then outlines the governor's plans and priorities for the upcoming legislative session. It's an update, it's a marker, it's a blueprint, it's a look back and a look forward, it's a reflection and a restart, it's a celebration of past successes and a springboard for new initiatives. In addition to the constitutional mandate, the State of the State address provides a unique annual opportunity for a governor to use a critical combination of policy levers and powers. First, the bully pulpit. They can use their address to build and raise awareness, shape the state dialogue and the discourse, and detail an overarching vision, agenda, and set of goals for the session. Second, their convening power. In this case, it's the legislators they'll need to move the priorities forward, to make progress on them, and they're right in the audience in front of them. And given media these days, the address has a larger audience. They're speaking to the local leaders, the parents, the families, the business leaders, the educators that they'll need to build and anchor these efforts across the state. And finally, budgetary authority, providing a preview or overview of how they propose to invest state dollars over the next year to fund their priorities. Now, in addition to the ongoing pandemic, there's a few contextual factors that I want to highlight before Cassidy, Zeke, and I dive a little bit deeper into specific education policy focus areas overall and within the State of the State addresses. First, it's noteworthy this year that there are 36 gubernatorial elections coming this November. That's the most in 4 years. 28 governors are up for re-election and 8 terms are coming to a close. And this bears on addresses because where a governor stands in the life cycle of their term generally impacts their focus for the state of the state. For new governors giving their first State of the State addresses, I can't say it better than a former governor once said, they're looking to translate the poetry of the campaign into the prose of governing. For governors running for re-election, it's marking what they've been able to achieve, the progress made, while making that kickoff case for a renewed second-term contract with their constituents. For governors giving their last State of the State, it's celebrating accomplishments while seeking to extend their legacy during this last session. Second, it's critical to view a governor's address through a prism of each state's unique education governance structure. State legislatures, state boards of education, and state education chiefs are all critical partners in whether a governor is able to move their agenda forward. To that point, it's important to keep in mind that right now, 39 of 50 states have so-called political trifectas, where a governor and both houses of the legislature are from the same party. Only one state in the entire country, Minnesota, has a split legislature with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. If there's inter-party alignment, and that's an if, but if there's inter-party alignment, that unity can provide a smoother road for passage of a governor's priorities. By contrast, in a state where there's a split between the governor and the legislature, the speech can be used as a sort of first volley of priorities and a way to make the case on what will likely be a session-long negotiation. And then there's state education chiefs, many appointed by the governor. I think there are some on right now, or at least former, and some that are separately elected, some appointed by a state board that may or may not be aligned with the governor. As many as 25 state education chiefs could change this year, which will almost certainly have a strong ripple effect on state education policies as well. With respect to appointed state education chiefs in particular, it's important when you're looking at a governor's priorities to closely track the actions of their chief and their Department of Education. When a Secretary Johnny Key of Arkansas, for instance, or Penny Schwinn in Tennessee, or Colt Gill in Oregon acts, they're almost certainly acting within the full faith, voice, and vision of the governor and as an extension of the governor's priorities. Third, I think it's worth noting that all governors spoke about education as a priority in some way in their State of the States. we've had the question over the years, where are the education governors of today? The Governor Hunt of North Carolina, the Governor Riley of South Carolina, Governor Kane of New Jersey, Governor Alexander of Tennessee, all these titans of education that were standing tall in the 80s and 90s, and they were. But the short answer is that all governors are education governors now. Back in that time, it was rare and more notable for a governor to speak to these issues, but now all governors do. Some may come at it more from the workforce side, some from the K12 side, some from early childhood, many from all three, but all are speaking to it in some form. Lastly, it's important to note that last year at this time, the American Rescue Plan had just been signed into law. So many of the state of the states were given prior to passage and presidential signature. So this is the first year where unprecedented federal education funding is part of the conversation, and where most state budgets are in a state of surplus and fiscally strong, which also wasn't as clear this time last year. So this bears out as to why so many addresses across parties spoke to increases for students, teachers, and schools. Now, I'll briefly just touch on governor's overall focus areas, and I point to 5 core areas in K-12 that governors are primarily focused on right now. And not surprisingly, you hear a lot of alignment with the governors covered in their State of the States, and that Cassidy and Zeke will do a deeper dive into, including with specific state examples in a few minutes. First, health and safety. Governors are continuing to work to safely reopen and keep open schools for in-person learning, to return, as our Vice Chair, Governor Murphy, has said, to schools where our kids' smiles once again light up hallways and classrooms. There's agreement across parties that generally there's no substitute for in-person learning, both academically and in terms of student well-being. So keeping students and staff safely back in school continues to be a top priority for all governors. This means ensuring easy, safe access to vaccines for teachers and age-eligible students, optimizing and upgrading ventilation, HVAC, and filtration systems, and utilizing testing, contact tracing, and evidence-based mitigation measures. Second, governors are continuing to work to close the digital divide and address the inequities and gaps in access to broadband, connectivity, and devices for students, teachers, and families, particularly in light of the $65 billion in the new bipartisan infrastructure law for addressing these gaps. Additionally, with most students back in the classroom, governors are also focusing on overall digital literacy and adoption, and how schools and teachers can leverage these new devices and connectivity to augment in-person learning and provide the professional learning supports to do so. This is a big cross-area focus at our organization right now, and a foundational part of Governor Hutchinson's NGA Chairman's initiative this year on K-12 computer science education. Third, governors are focused on academic recovery and accelerated learning programs to address interrupted learning and lost instructional time during COVID. Governors know this will be a multi-year issue and are tackling it through intensive tutoring, expanded learning time, and by leveraging summer learning and enrichment to re-engage students and facilitate and build the capacity of partnerships with community-based organizations, after-school programs, camps, and sports programs at the local level. Fourth, for governors, education recovery is focused not only on academic recovery, but also on addressing student and staff well-being and mental health, given the increased fear, anxiety, and stress brought on by the pandemic over the past 2 years. NGA is currently working with a bipartisan group of governors on addressing these needs, and we've seen 2 dominant themes through the project. One, a real interest in cross-agency collaboration. There's been so much work between health and education and human services during this time on addressing the health and safety of students, and a real continued interest on addressing these needs by working together, continued partnerships. And second, engaging parents, families, educators, and students to advance these efforts through focus groups and listening sessions. Lastly, governors are working to address amplified educator and school staff shortages. To address these shortages in the short term, governors are looking to substitute teachers, resident teachers, and paraprofessionals to fill the gap. They're also investing in additional school counselors and school psychologists to help with student well-being. And to address the shortages for the long term, and you'll hear about this in just a little bit from Zeke and Cassidy, you've seen a real focus on boosting teacher salaries and strengthening their educator pipelines to better recruit, attract, and retain school staff. So I'll stop there, but that's just a snapshot into what we're seeing at NGA across the country. I look forward to your questions after Zeke and Cassidy's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth, for that overview and to give us the perspective from the National Governors Association. I'm also excited to get into the trends in the year's State of the State addresses that we've been tracking. And leading today's presentation is Cassidy Francies, a policy researcher here at ECS and one of our senior policy analysts, Zeke Perez. Cassidy, why don't you start us off today?
Thank you for that introduction, Jeremy. Our policy team has been busy working on summarizing Governor's State of the State addresses over the last couple of months and tracking education-related items mentioned. Today, we are going to talk through some trends and go over some examples of things mentioned in Governor's addresses. If you are interested in additional information about this year's addresses, we have a tracking resource on our website where you can look at any given state summary broken down by education topics. ECS has been tracking and summarizing Governor's State of the State addresses every year since 2005. So we're able to pull some interesting longitudinal trends from our tracking. In the last several years, teacher issues, workforce development, post-secondary affordability, and funding are all issue areas that have consistently been top of mind for governors. Each of these topics has made the top 6 trending issue areas nearly every year since 2012, when ECS began writing the State of the State's report to accompany our tracking. In fact, workforce development has been a top issue every single year, and teacher issues, post-secondary affordability, and funding have been top issues all but 1 year. Since 2020, we've seen some changes in the trending topics. For example, in 2020, student health was a top trending issue for the first time since we started writing the report. It has continued to make the top 6 issues since then. Additionally, early learning was trending every year until 2021, when it failed to make the top 6 for the first time. It did not make the list of top issues again this year, but it's important to note that governors are still talking about early learning in their addresses. It just hasn't been mentioned enough to make the top 6 issues in the last 2 years. When looking at 2021 compared to this year's addresses, we see a lot of the same issue areas trending, including funding, workforce development, learning recovery and success, and physical and mental health. However, this year, the focus was less on the immediate needs of states as they deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and shifted more to long-term rebuilding and success. With that, we saw teacher staffing and post-secondary affordability make their way back into the top 6 in place of some of the more pandemic-specific trends that we saw in 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly had an impact on what governors focused on during their State of the State addresses in the last couple of years. Specifically, we saw a focus on student health and wellness, concentrating both on the physical health of students during the pandemic, but also on their mental and emotional well-being as they dealt with remote learning and generally a lot of uncertainty in the last few years. During the pandemic, especially during 2021, we also saw governors shift from discussing long-term strategies to really focus on their state's more immediate needs, and also saw a focus on student operations with discussions of physical health during the pandemic, in-person versus remote learning, access to broadband and technology, and other operational difficulties that schools were faced with during the pandemic. As I mentioned earlier, this year, although the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts were still prevalent in governors' addresses, we saw a return to more long-term priorities. I'll pass it off to Zeke now to talk about this year's addresses before we dive into the trends and some state examples.
Great, thank you, Cassidy, and thanks everyone for spending some of your day with us today. First, I want to echo Cassidy in giving a big shout out to the members of our policy team who have been busy ringing in the new year, summarizing education components of Governor's State of the State addresses. To date, we have summarized addresses from 46 governors across 45 states and the US Virgin Islands. And of the remaining states and territories, we anticipate summarizing at least one more this week in Ohio. A handful of other governors are either not giving an address this year or do not have one scheduled yet. So first, look at some overarching trends. We found that 27 governors mentioned reopening schools, either commending district leaders, teachers, and other individuals for working to keep schools open, or highlighting the importance of in-person learning for students generally. This year's mentions were more retrospective compared to 2021's, which tended to highlight specific plans and policies in reopening schools. Addresses this year highlighted the progress that states have made in keeping schools open. In a similar look back, 15 governors discussed federal relief funds, specifically highlighting various uses and applications of those funds on education matters. So as Cassidy discussed earlier, we pulled the top trending education issues from across 46 addresses our team summarized. We recently released our special report on those trends, which you'll notice here are K12 funding, workforce development, teacher staffing, physical and mental health, post-secondary affordability, and learning recovery and success. Today, we'll spend some time discussing what we captured in each of those trends, and we'll highlight some state examples, including many that weren't featured in the report. So with that, I'll send it back to Cassidy to discuss the first three issues.
Thanks, Zeke. At least 36 governors discussed K12 funding in their State of the State addresses this year. The topics discussed under funding are wide-ranging and can vary based on the individual governor and state priorities. But a couple of common themes that we saw across a handful of states this year were calls to fully fund education and adjusting state funding formulas. Especially as states build back from the COVID-19 pandemic, governors were committed to fully funding education and restoring any cuts to education that happened over the past couple of years. We also saw governors discuss adjusting their state's funding formulas and amounts, sometimes specifically calling for more funding for certain groups of students. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp is one example of a governor who discussed fully funding the budget. In his State of the State address, he proposed increasing funding for education by $425 million in the 2023 budget to fully fund schools and remove austerity cuts from the pandemic. Governor Kemp also proposed appropriately funding the school funding formula to hire more teachers, reduce class sizes, and ensure that every child receives a quality education. Another example of a governor who mentioned K12 funding is Governor Sisolak in Nevada. Governor Sisolak highlighted that Nevada raised per pupil funding to a new high. He also noted 11,000 teacher identified projects that the state has helped fund. Moving on to our next trend, at least 35 governors mentioned workforce development and career and technical education in their addresses this year, often mentioning state investments in workforce training and CTE or successes of various workforce systems. At least a handful of governors discussed using federal pandemic relief funds for workforce development and CTE in their addresses this year as well. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis mentioned workforce development and CTE in his address when he praised Florida for adding over 50 new apprenticeship programs over the last 3 years. He also noted that credentials earned through the state's workforce initiatives have paved the way for employment in fields like aviation, logistics, and welding, and that these initiatives deserve support. Maine Governor Janet Mills was also among the governors who mentioned workforce development and CTE in their State of the State addresses. She discussed efforts to expand CTE programs so that children can be taught earlier. Governor Mills also announced plans to expand the Maine Career Exploration Program so that high school students can explore future careers through paid work. Teacher staffing issues were also top of mind for governors once again in this year's State of the State addresses. Governors often called for increased teacher pay and mentioned efforts to recruit and retain a diverse and qualified teacher workforce. This year, at least 23 governors mentioned these issues. New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham proposed a 7% pay increase for every educator in the state during her State of the State address this year. She noted that this increase would make New Mexico first in the region for average educator pay. Governor Lujan Grisham also proposed raising the starting salaries of every tier of educator and noted the importance of recruiting high-quality teachers and retaining talented professionals for the success of education in the state. Governor Kim Reynolds of Iowa also discussed teacher staffing issues in her speech. She announced a registered teacher apprenticeship program in the state that would enable high school students to earn a paraeducator credential and an associate degree in high school and credit that experience towards student teaching. I'll hand it back over to Zeke now to discuss some of the other trends we noted during this year's addresses.
Thank you. So first up, I'll discuss health. Physical and mental health are a key component of students and staff's overall well-being and can be contributors to educational engagement and academic success. Here, we track mentions of health by 20 governors. These mentions focused on physical and mental health for both students and school staff and across the education spectrum from early learning through post-secondary education. In many cases, governors discussed investments in the provision of physical and mental health resources in K12 schools and on post-secondary campuses, seeking to increase the availability of things like school meals, personal protective equipment, or COVID testing, or to increase access to valuable mental health services and supports through nurses, counselors, and social workers. In physical health, Kentucky's Coverings for Kids initiative provided masks to students attending schools in person. Other states discuss similar programs, as well as the use of federal funds to provide masks and health equipment to students and staff. In the US Virgin Islands, Governor Albert Bryan Jr. celebrated a $13 million investment in payments for students' nutrition, and that's one of several approaches that we've seen governors mention in providing meals for students. In mental health, Alabama noted state efforts to support school-based mental health resources, including collaborations between the Departments of Mental Health and Education. And in Wisconsin, the Get Kids Ahead initiative will provide access to increased funding for public and independent charter schools in the state, allowing them to build out comprehensive school-based mental health systems for students and staff. Next up, our post-secondary affordability tracking combined mentions of post-secondary financial aid and efforts around tuition, costs, and student debt. In total, 21 governors discussed post-secondary affordability. Some governors addressed tuition levels either system or statewide, including implementing tuition freezes or providing additional state funding to dissuade institutions from increasing their tuition. Other governors discussed providing financial aid or forgiving student loans, often for specific student populations. So to highlight some examples there, first in Colorado, Governor Jared Polis proposed more support for state institutions, including increased investments in higher education generally, and expanded availability of financial aid to reduce costs and to keep tuition flat. To address costs and student debt, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy provided tax benefits to individuals making in-state tuition payments or investing in college savings plans. And then on the financial aid side, we saw a number of governors announce the creation or expansion of scholarship programs, tuition assistance programs, or loan forgiveness programs. In many cases, those programs were created for specific student populations or for certain industries. So in Illinois, we saw Governor J.B. Pritzker proposed investing in healthcare with new scholarship and loan forgiveness programs for nurses and medical professionals. And in North Dakota, we saw Governor Doug Burgum provide full funding for the state's National Guard tuition assistance program. And our final trend is learning recovery and success. So over the last couple of years, state policymakers have focused in on how to address and measure interrupted instruction caused by the pandemic. This year, we identified 17 governors discussing the topic, and we were pleased to see many of them celebrating successes in student achievement and learning recovery. Many highlighted further investments in learning recovery and in efforts like out-of-school time programming. So some states have established summer camps or other out-of-school time programs aimed at getting students caught up on interrupted instruction. Arizona's State of the State featured their Back on Track summer camp, which seeks to get students caught up in key subjects like reading, math, and civics. And Indiana's State of the State praised the Department of Education for their $160 million investment in accelerated learning recovery programs and pointed to a second wave of those programs underway this year. We expect to see states continue to invest in and innovate learning recovery approaches throughout 2022 and beyond. And with that, I'll send it to Jeremy to get us started on our Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much to Seth and to Cassidy and to Zeke for sharing the trends that we've seen in our review of all of these State of the State addresses. We've got some good questions that have been coming into the comments. So if you have other questions, please add them to the chat. But Maisha, why don't you go ahead and kick us off with our first question?
Sure. So the first question is, what are governors assuming about learning loss? A nascent concept that is difficult to measure. Are they adding money to budgets, punishing schools, or something in between?
I think I can take that first, and thanks for that question. This is a really, as I was saying up at the top, a core issue of what governors are focused on right now. And I think they're looking at all sorts of different options for trying to address students' lost instructional time and interrupted learning during this time. One of the examples I try to point to, because I think it's very thoughtful and intentional, is Governor Lee in Tennessee, where they looked at the student data and they looked at the assessment results and took a step back and said, okay, what's the interventions that we need? We're going to make sure that we're taking the interventions and putting them to where the students need the most support. And we're going to look at things like tutoring. We're going to look at things like extended day, partnering with summer learning and enrichment programs. They had put already last year, and that continues now, $160 million for summer learning and enrichment to try to get some academic recovery, particularly for K-8 students, and then after school tutoring programs to really address those needs as well. So, governors are looking sort of across the board at multiple different avenues for doing it, but right now they're providing, not only are they using the bully pulpit to say this is an important issue and we need to do this thoughtfully, and they're doing that in their state of the states as well, but then they're providing the money to do so as well. Another state that comes to mind as you ask that question is Governor Scott has provided, in Vermont, has provided multiple years of funding for, again, using that leveraging of the summer and expanded time, 4 million last year, and then another 5 million this year. And you think about a state like Vermont, the kind of difference that's going to make over the next 3 years, $9 million together to address some of these needs. So putting an investment behind it and looking at different options and what's working in different states and sharing that with each other is the key going forward.
That's
Yeah,
great. Go ahead,
I'll
Zeke.
join in too and give Tennessee some more kudos, I think. Tennessee established the Education Recovery and Innovation Commission. And I think that piece of that question about measuring interrupted instruction and learning recovery is very important. So that commission in Tennessee took a look at some of the pre-pandemic data. They were tasked with collecting data throughout the pandemic and revisiting that. And I think they're doing a lot to, one, acknowledge that there were pre-existing gaps for students and different student populations within the state in achievement, and starting to think about how to see how those were exacerbated by the pandemic and how to address those gaps, and just make better use of the data that the state already collects. And I think we've seen from other states a shift in focus in measuring and in applying those measurements. So just wanted to add to Tennessee's kudos there.
One of the other questions that we received was actually from Christina in Hawaii, wanting to know the gender and racial data of governors. I do not have that for governors who are up for re-election, which was your question actually, Christina, but I can tell you, and Seth can verify, that there's currently 9 female governors across America. 47 of the 50 governors are non-Hispanic white. New Mexico's Governor Grisham is Hispanic. Hawaii's Governor Ige is Asian, and Oklahoma Governor Stitt is a member of the Cherokee Nation. We can try to get that information on governors who are up for re-election. Also, we wouldn't have that for all of the candidates for governor yet, because in some states you still have an ability to file for that. Maisha, you want to take the next question maybe?
Sure. John England asks, can you help us understand what it means to fully fund education? What are the measures used to define a fully funded education at the state level?
Seth or Zeke, anybody want to jump on this one? I've got a few ideas.
Well, Jeremy, you can take it, but I think one of the things I'll just mention to here is just that when we're talking about education budgets and looking at what's inside of those, I think this year in particular, one of the things that most resonated with me was how many issues governors are tackling with their education budgets, that they're not just focused on educator workforce issues, and they're not just focused on addressing academic recovery, but also student well-being, staff well-being, the digital literacy aspects we talked about, some of the health and safety. So taking all on at once and addressing those through multiple different avenues. And that's why you're seeing, I think, not just straight raises in education funding, but really getting into particulars of how to address these challenges in a particularly challenging time.
Yeah, and Seth, I just add that sometimes there's two, I'm not an attorney, want to get that out there first, two more legal definitions. Usually fully funded means that you're covering all of the basic mandatory requirements for education, even if it's a tough recession time for a state. The second definition is there are some states that have some Supreme Court cases in their state dealing with what is funding. And in those states, there's usually down to a dollar figure that has been defined and approved by their state Supreme Court, which would mean they're meeting that threshold that the Supreme Court said would be fully funded. It does vary by state to state. And there are a lot of governors and a lot of legislatures, as Seth mentioned, who are really looking at new funding in new areas in result to the pandemic and where they see some needs in their states. One of the questions that we had was from Kelly Wolf around how or if the role of teletherapy or telehealth comes up in the mental health priorities of states and governors. So Seth or Cassidy or Zeke, any ideas on what we've seen on some of that?
Absolutely.
Jump in real quick and go ahead, Zeke.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say that, especially legislatively, we saw a lot of states seek to create telehealth options over the past few years. I think thinking of state of the states this year, a lot of the focus did shift a little bit more to those in-person options. But that, it did see a few states as well that continued to invest in and maintain those telehealth support options. Cassidy, what were you going to add there? Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, just echo what you say that legislatively, especially last year, we saw that expansion with remote learning. Now that governors are kind of shifting back to in-person, they're focused on some of the workforce issues, getting enough people in the classrooms, getting those in-person services to students, focusing on whole child social emotional well-being of students, not as much on telehealth as they were in the previous year, but it's definitely still there.
Okay, I've got the next question coming in from Goldie Thompson. She asks, how many governors talked about physical and mental health?
Yeah, just double checking our count there. And our tracker on our website breaks those down a little bit more specifically. Overall, we were at 20 mentions, I believe, for physical and mental health total. And that, meant a lot of different things in a lot of different states. Some governors just addressed and recognized the impacts that the pandemic has had on students' physical and mental health. A number pointed to specific investments in either of those avenues. So it really varied. Yeah, I think we're at 20 for that. And it was, fairly evenly split between physical discussions and mental health discussions, I'd say.
And I'll just add that this is another, very core bipartisan issue right now. Some specific examples, one from state of the state, but then followed up with a budget. Governor Inslee has asked for $900 million to address student well-being, and he's talking about there not only training teachers in that way, but also adding school nurses, counselors, social workers, psychologists. And I think this came up in the chat a bit, but as we were talking about those accelerated learning strategies, certainly governors are thinking this way. We're supporting them in this way. They're thinking of them together, that this is academic supports, but then at the same time, you have to address those holistic needs and build to sustain the relationships that are at the center of education. So they're thinking about it in that way. And there's governors that even pre-pandemic were focused on student well-being. I think about Governor DeWine just giving his remarks, but he had a student wellness fund even starting in 2019. But during the pandemic, giving the amplified need, he certainly doubled down on proposing record increases to making sure that there's funds available for school districts to be able to use those funds to meet student and staff needs right now. And I think with these record investments, one of the interesting things will be, right, this is flowing to districts and schools. So really being able to track how those funds are being used and some of the innovative ways you're talking about, telehealth. There's lots of flexibility in how to use them to meet student and staff needs, and being able to track where there's innovation in schools and districts, and then elevating that back up to the state and national level will be critically important.
One of the questions we have is around ECS tracking specific legislative actions or bills. And the example that was in the question was around parents' bills of rights. And we track every single piece of legislation across the entire country in all 50 states and the territories. And a lot of that you can see if you get on our website where we actually have our bill tracker, and you can put in specific issues, and it will show you where the largest number of bills are in certain states around that issue. And then it can also link you to tracking the bills. We do analysis on all of the bills that become law or are vetoed by a governor. We do analysis on a lot of other bills, but we don't do every single bill that's out there. And so that's kind of the best way to kind of look at that question and where it is. Maisha, I might turn the questions over to you because the next two, I think, are both centered around kind of learning loss, learning recovery, very similar.
Okay, so the next question is coming from Mari Watanabe Rose. And the question is, how do they measure learning loss? Have there been any learning recovery programs in higher education?
Yeah, I think sorry, Seth. I think the higher education piece is a good question. That I think we'll need to look into that to see how different systems or different states are measuring that. From what I've seen, just legislatively in measuring it in K12, I think making use of existing state longitudinal data systems. I think a number of states have introduced new task forces or working groups that will look at introducing new measures. Again, the Tennessee example, they have, I think, released 2 reports now that kind of look at pre-pandemic data with the new data they captured. So I think that's a good example of where states might be headed. But I think it really depends on the state. Seth, do you have anything to add there? Sorry about that.
No, that's great, Zeke. I was going to say something very similar that, for K12, really looking at those state assessments. And I think, the key issue there is just to think about in 2020 that most of the assessments had been, had not gone forward. In 2021, you didn't have all the data. And now in 2022, we're going to have that full set of data, providing even more of a catalyst for truly understanding, where has that lost instructional time had the most impact, and then being able to meet the needs. So again, going back to that, this is really needs to be thought of, and we are thinking about it certainly at NGA and governors are as a multi-year issue, because on both the holistic needs side and on the learning acceleration side, there's gaps to be made there, and we're it'll take some time to do so.
So one of the questions that we have is really around tracking last dollar scholarship programs. And we do track that at ECS. Welcome to see if Seth or Cassidy or Zeke have any insights, but I can put a couple of links in where we already are tracking a lot of different state financial aid programs. There are a good number of states who are looking at last dollar programs, which are really helping to guarantee that students can go. In many states, it's if you are Pell eligible for some post-secondary institution, that at the state institutions, the state is paying the last dollars to guarantee that you can go to school if the Pell doesn't cover all of those expenses. So I will put a couple of links in there that are to a couple of reports we've done to answer your question, Alyssa. But I don't know if Zeke or Cassidy or Seth, you have anything to add to that. Okay, we'll take that as a no. We'll go to the next one then. Are we seeing governors address the need for remediation reform in higher ed, such as eliminating standardized placement tests or replacing remedial courses with more effective co-requisite models? The example that's given in the question is a little bit around California and what they've done in some of their major reform that's been recent. So I know, Seth, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, just the phrasing of that is something that we're that governors are so much more focused on the learning acceleration point and less about remediation, but seeing really truly understanding where is the data showing where students are. They're going to be in different places, getting a true understanding of that and that context, and then being able to match the interventions to it. There's the funding for the first time in a long time to be able to do this over a number of years. And so being able to thoughtfully, not, Zeke's mentioned a few times Tennessee, there's other states, North Carolina, Idaho, also doing similar sort of data mining parts to see where students are and waiting for some of that new data, but then matching the interventions to it. So again, taking students where they are and moving them forward and understanding that there was things that they did pick up even during the time we think about that digital literacy skills. It's not just saying, okay, we're going back to 2019 or early 2020, but how do we harness some of that new technology, the new devices, the connectivity, the internet access that students now have, the broadband that we talked about, that $65 billion, and use it as a platform for ensuring that teachers and students and families can use it in new ways and build on those new skills.
And I would just add that some of the work we have at ECS, I'd urge you to go to Strong Start to Finish. That's our program that we're working on, helping to get first generation or students of color or low income students to and through the first year of college. It's really focused on some of those effective co-requisite models. We have 13 states that have been doing scalable policies over the last 3 years. And there's a lot of opportunity that we see there in some of the state policies. California is one of those states that is part of those 13 that we have in our Strong Start to Finish program. Maisha, you want to grab the next question and we'll see if we have time to finish out some of the rest of these.
Sure. So this is coming from Dr. Erica Hernandez Scott. The question is, are you seeing governors address issues of book banning and anti-equity work that has a significant impact on students' learning?
Yeah, I would just say our experience, we're working with bipartisan states right now on those student well-being and equity issues. And what we found is the best thing to help them navigate those conversations is twofold. Number one, really being specific about the kind of skills and knowledge that you're trying to impart to students. The more specific you are, the more critical that there's more buy-in to it, right? When we're talking about things like personal success skills or health and safety, you're really talking about our social emotional skills. You're talking about collaboration, communication, problem solving, adaptability. Those are the kind of skills that one, employers want, businesses want in a state, and two, that there is much more buy-in around for stakeholders in your state to get around. And we found some success in navigating in that way and talking about the specific skills that you're trying to impart as a governor and to imbue. And then second, providing a key governor role, really being that convening power, right, that we talked about a little earlier, which is to provide that space and conditions and environment for a dialogue to happen, to go into that community and allow for parents and families, communities, educators to have a voice, students themselves. And so in a number of different states right now, that's what governors have been doing. They've been going to communities and making sure that there has been amplified change, especially around student well-being, around mental health right now. Parents want to be heard. There's a lot of other issues that are packaged into some of the angst right now around parents, and getting back into schools. And now that that's there, make sure that there's voices to be heard and make sure it's part of the conversation.
So the final question for our presenters, are there any trends that you saw in some of the governors' state of the states that were a surprise to you? I mean, you had, 2 or 3 governors that said this, which was a surprise, or there were just as many that went to the right, that went to the left on a certain issue. Any surprise trends that any of the 3 of you saw?
Yeah, I can start there. I think for us, one thing that was surprising was that there was a lot of consensus around the top 6 issues, right? We'd had over a third of governors mentioning those. Typically in other years in our brief, we're able to point to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 other issues that a lot of governors are talking about. We didn't have that consensus this year with any honorable mentions or lower level issues. There were a number of states mentioning early learning that was kind of right on the cusp, but under that third of governors threshold. A few other issues like that, but for the most part, governors seem to focus in on a select set of issues. So that was a little surprising to see.
Yeah, and I'll kind of jump off of that. Not necessarily specific to this year's addresses, but I think generally overall looking at the trends, just the consistency year after year in the top 6 trends was kind of surprising to me that, 4 or 5 of them are mentioned year after year.
And I would just add, I think that's exactly, Zeke and Cassidy, exactly, I want to echo those and just say something I was alluding to before, which is just that really seeing governors tackle so many different issues. Governor Ivey, for instance, she talked about math, literacy, teacher pay, academic recovery, mental health, and early childhood education all in one speech. If you go to some of her previous ones, she may tackle 1 or 2 of those issues, but really given the scope of challenges right now, making sure that gubernatorial leadership on these issues and setting the tone for that this is important, really coming out in support of that. You saw similarly Governor Newsom and his budget, $120 billion in a big state, but really just tackling things around broadband and digital literacy, mental health, early childhood education, academic recovery, summer learning, community schools. So, again, governors sort of taking the lead on tackling many different issues. And I would also just say, and I think this is reflective of, we had our winter meeting earlier this year, just a couple months ago, but the sense of a tone of, that we're bridging out of this and an idealism a little bit. I think there was a tone in many of these speeches of, let's try to find the bridge out of this a little more. I think last year you were in the midst of it. You were trying you weren't sure where the course would go, but I think just from a tone overall on a bipartisan basis, it's trying to come to the next chapter. Lots of challenges to go, but I think there was an idealistic sort of tone to a lot of the speeches.
Well, thank you all for those great questions and for your participation today. We really do appreciate each of you joining us, and a huge applause for Cassidy, Zeke, and Seth, our presenters today. It was our great privilege to feature each of you.
To our audience, please remember that Education Commission of the States is here to support you in your work. We value your feedback and would greatly appreciate it if you would please take a couple minutes while the experience is fresh to share your thoughts and opinions on today's event. A link will be provided when we adjourn. For our next Partnering for Success webinar, we will discuss building a strong teacher workforce through apprenticeships. That will take place Wednesday, April 20th. Look for more details soon. Today's session was recorded and will be shared in your post-event email.
If you have any additional questions or would like to network, I hope that you will reach out to us at ECS. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at our future ECS events. Thanks again for joining us today.